Saturday morning. My cabin door was open. Karen swore she saw a stranger inside. Neighbors gathered, whispering, "Call the police." I just stood there, key in hand. Something about her panic felt rehearsed. Her fingers trembled reaching for her phone. She smiled like she already knew the ending. She had no idea what I'd installed inside. My name is Daniel Cole, and for 6 years I've owned a small lakeside cabin at Willow Ridge Estates, the last thing my father left me before he passed. I work as a structural engineer in Denver, but every free weekend I drive 2 hours north just to sit on that porch and breathe. My wife Rachel and I had planned to retire there one day, turning the old cabin into our forever home. We'd already started small renovations, new gutters, a repainted deck, nothing that broke a single HOA rule. I never imagined a woman named Deborah Hanley would try to take it from us. Deborah Hanley had run Willow Ridge Estates HOA for 9 years, and everyone called her the sheriff behind her back. She measured mailbox heights with a tape measure, fined a widow for wind chimes, and kept a master binder of alleged violations dating back to 2017. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. She'd been re-elected every year unopposed, mostly because nobody wanted the headache of running against her. Board meetings became her personal stage. 30 minutes of agenda, 90 minutes of lectures about community standards nobody remembered voting on. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. Rachel warned me early, she said the first summer we owned the cabin. I laughed it off then, assuming Deborah was just an overzealous retiree with too much time and a laminated rulebook. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. The HOA required a master key for emergency inspections, fire safety, pipe bursts, anything urgent while owners were away. Every homeowner signed the form without much thought. I signed mine too, never imagining what emergency would come to mean for Deborah. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. I noticed small things first. A chair on my porch moved 2 feet left. A window I always left cracked, shut tight. I blamed raccoons, high winds, my own forgetfulness, anything but the possibility that someone had been inside while I wasn't home. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. At the spring meeting, Deborah announced a new beautification initiative, requiring uniform paint colors across all cabins. Mine, painted forest green by my father in 1998, didn't match her approved palette. She circled my address on a printed map, right in front of everyone. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. "It's not personal, Daniel," she said, smiling the way people smile when it's entirely personal. "Standards protect property values for everyone." I told her I'd think about it. She wrote something in her binder before I even finished my sentence. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. My neighbor Frank Delgado pulled me aside afterward. "She fined me $800 for a shed I built for my dead father's tools," he muttered. "Fought it for a year. The place instead of dealing with her anymore." I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. I started paying closer attention to how Deborah operated. She didn't yell or threaten outright. She used committees, fine schedules, and vague clauses in the covenant nobody had actually read cover to cover except her. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Her husband, Gary Hanley, rarely spoke at meetings. He'd sit in the back row, eyes on his phone, occasionally wincing at something she said. Caught him once, after a meeting, quietly apologizing to a woman Deborah had just humiliated over a garden gnome. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. That spring, 3 cabins near the lake's north shore went up for sale within 2 months of each other. All owners citing personal reasons. I didn't think much of it then. Later, I'd learn every single one of them had crossed Deborah first. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. Rachel and I finally repainted the shutters, choosing the closest legal shade to our original green. Deborah still sent a letter calling it borderline non-compliant and requesting a follow-up inspection. I replied politely, attaching photos and the paint chip matching her own approved chart. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. She didn't respond to my email. Instead, 2 days later, I came up for a weekend and found my porch swing had been removed entirely, a citation taped to my door for an item never mentioned in any rulebook I'd read. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. I called the HOA office. A tired part-timer named Cheryl admitted quietly that Deborah handled special cases herself and didn't always log them the normal way. That was the first time I felt something colder than annoyance. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. At the next meeting I asked, calmly, why my swing was removed without written notice. Deborah smiled at the room and said maintenance staff had mistaken it for storage clutter. Nobody on the maintenance staff, as I later learned, had been there that week. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. Frank found me in the parking lot afterward. She's not just strict, he said, lowering his voice. She likes control. Watch your back, Daniel. I mean that. I nodded, still not fully believing him. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. That summer I installed a basic doorbell camera, mostly for peace of mind about wildlife and storms. I didn't expect it to matter. I just wanted a record of my own porch, my own property, in case anything else went missing. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. 2 weeks later, the camera caught a woman in a wide sun hat walking up my steps at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday when I was 90 miles away at work. She used a key. She owned the place. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. I zoomed in on the blurry clip a dozen times before I recognized the sun hat from a photo in the HOA newsletter. It was Deborah. For 11 minutes. Then walked out adjusting something in her purse before locking the door behind her. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. I didn't confront her right away. I wanted proof, patterns, something undeniable, because I already sensed that accusing Deborah Hanley of anything without ironclad evidence would turn the entire community against me instead of her. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. So I waited, watched, and quietly started documenting everything: dates, times, small items slightly out of place. I had no idea yet how far she'd already gone, or how much worse things were about to become. Word of it moved through Willow Ridge the way word always did there, quietly and then all at once. The following month, I found a notice of unauthorized entry taped to my own door, accusing me of forcibly entering a community storage closet near the clubhouse, a building I'd never once stepped inside. Word of it moved through Willow Ridge the way word always did there, quietly and then all at once. I called Deborah directly this time. She answered on the first ring, her voice syrupy. "Daniel, we take security seriously here," she said, as if reciting a script. I told her I had never gone near that storage closet in my life. It was the kind of thing people noticed but didn't quite know what to do with yet. "The camera footage says otherwise," she said. I asked to see it. Just half a second too long. Then claimed the footage had already been reviewed and archived by the board and wasn't available for individual owners to request. It was the kind of thing people noticed but didn't quite know what to do with yet. That refusal bothered me more than the accusation itself. Rachel agreed. "It supposedly proves you did something wrong," she asked over dinner. Neither of us had a good answer, only a growing sense that something didn't add up. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves started exchanging glances I hadn't seen before that week. At the emergency board meeting, Deborah called. She stood at the podium and read my name aloud like a verdict already decided. "Repeated disregard for community property," she said, while several neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves started exchanging glances I hadn't seen before that week. I stood up and asked, calmly, for evidence. Deborah said the matter was under review and would be discussed further at a future date, a phrase I later learned she used whenever she had nothing real to show anyone. For the first time in months, it felt like the whole community was quietly holding its breath together. Frank leaned over and whispered, "That's her move. She threatens fines and hearings until people just give up and pay to make it go away." I told him I wasn't planning on giving up anything. For the first time in months, it felt like the whole community was quietly holding its breath together. 2 days later, a fine notice arrived by mail, $400 for the storage closet incident, due within 30 days or subject to a lien against my property. I read it twice, certain there had to be a mistake. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. I drove up that weekend specifically to check my doorbell camera history for the date listed on the fine. The footage showed nothing unusual, just my quiet porch, wind moving the trees, no sign of me anywhere near any clubhouse. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. I brought the footage to Cheryl at the HOA office, hoping for a reasonable resolution. She looked genuinely nervous flipping through my printed timestamps. "I can log a dispute," she said quietly. "But Deborah reviews all disputes personally before the board sees them." I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. The dispute vanished into a black hole for 3 weeks. No updates, no responses, nothing but silence from an office that suddenly stopped returning my calls entirely, as though I'd become invisible to everyone but the fine collector. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. Rachel suggested contacting a lawyer, just to understand our rights under the HOA covenant. The attorney we spoke with, a calm woman named Patricia Nguyen, said flatly that undocumented fines without video evidence were rarely enforceable, if we pushed back correctly. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Armed with that advice, I sent a formal written dispute citing the covenant's own evidence requirements. 3 days later, Deborah replied personally for the first time, her email dripping with false warmth, insisting the fine would regrettably still stand. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. That's when I noticed the email signature line, Deborah Hanley, HOA president and property consultant. I hadn't known she worked in real estate. Rachel found her listing online within minutes, a small brokerage specializing in distressed lakeside property acquisitions. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Clicked slowly, then all at once. Every neighbor who sold after crossing Deborah had listed with brokers connected to her old firm. Frank's shed fine. 2 months. My sudden, baseless fine. Pattern. Not coincidence. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. I didn't have proof yet. Only a theory forming faster than evidence could catch up to it. But the timing, the pressure, the refusal to show camera footage, it all pointed towards something bigger than one overzealous HOA president enforcing paint colors. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. I mentioned my suspicion to Frank over the phone. He went quiet for a long moment. She offered to personally handle the sale of my place before I even decided to leave, he finally said. I thought she was just being helpful. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Helpful wasn't the word I'd have used anymore. I started keeping a folder screenshots, fine notices, the camera clip of her entering my cabin, Frank's story, the brokerage listing building something I hoped I'd never actually need to use. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. Deborah, unaware I was documenting anything, grew bolder. A second fine arrived for unauthorized landscaping alterations, even though I hadn't touched the yard in months. It felt less like enforcement now and more like pressure, deliberate and personal. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. At the next meeting, she brought up my pattern of noncompliance to the full board, suggesting a formal hearing that could, under the covenant's harshest clause, eventually force a property lien or even a forced sale for unpaid fines. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. I sat in that folding chair, heart pounding, and realized this wasn't about paint or porches or storage closets anymore. Deborah wanted my cabin, the same way she'd apparently wanted the others before mine, and she was willing to manufacture violations to get it. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. The formal hearing was scheduled for the second Saturday of the following month, held in the clubhouse Deborah controlled like her personal courtroom. I asked Patricia, our attorney, to review the covenant's hearing procedures before I said another word to the board. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. Patricia found something interesting. The covenant required any accuser to present time-stamped photographic or video evidence at hearings, evidence Deborah had conveniently never once produced in either of my two disputes. She'd been relying entirely on people's fear of pushing back. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. I requested, in writing, that all evidence supporting both fines be submitted 5 business days before the hearing, exactly as the covenant demanded. Cheryl confirmed receipt of my request. Deborah did not respond to it directly, which told me everything. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. Rachel started attending community events with me again, chatting quietly with other homeowners, gently asking if anyone else had unresolved disputes with the board. 3 separate families admitted, almost in whispers, that they'd been fined for things they insisted they never did. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. One of them, an elderly man named Walter Briggs, said Deborah had accused him of storing hazardous materials in his garage. Turned out to be his late wife's gardening fertilizer. Perfectly legal, sitting exactly where it had sat for a decade. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. Walter had paid the fine rather than fight it, worried about his health and unwilling to deal with confrontation at 78 years old. Hearing that made something in me harden. This wasn't really about rules. It was about who was too tired or scared to resist. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. I started a quiet spreadsheet, cross-referencing every fine Deborah had issued over the past 3 years with property sale dates and buyer names pulled from public county records. The pattern Frank hinted at became undeniable, laid out in cold, sortable rows. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. At least 6 properties had been fined heavily, sold under pressure, then resold within a year at higher prices through agents linked to Deborah's old brokerage license, which technically remained active despite her claiming years ago she'd retired from real estate. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. I brought this spreadsheet to Patricia, who went unusually quiet reading it. "This isn't just HOA overreach anymore," she said carefully. "If proven, this could be fraud, conflict of interest, possibly extortion under state property law." My stomach turned at the word. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. The hearing arrived faster than I felt ready for it. Deborah opened with a folder of supporting documents that turned out to be printed screenshots of a community Facebook group where a neighbor had once jokingly complained about my wild front yard. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Nothing about landscaping violations. Nothing about the storage closet. Nothing resembling actual evidence, just vague social commentary dressed up as testimony. I calmly asked where the time-stamped photographic evidence required by the covenant was. The room went uncomfortably silent. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. Deborah's smile flickered for the first time since I'd known her. "We don't need to show every technicality to a homeowner," she said, glancing at the other board members like she expected automatic backup. 2 of them looked down at their hands instead. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. I presented my own doorbell footage from both disputed dates, clearly showing no activity near the clubhouse or my yard matching her accusations. A board member named Priya Patel actually leaned forward, squinting at the timestamps like she was seeing something for the first time. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. This directly contradicts the fines, Priya said slowly. Deborah cut in fast, insisting board footage was more reliable than any homeowner's personal camera, despite never once producing that supposed board footage for anyone to actually review or verify. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. The hearing ended without a resolution, tabled pending further review, the same delay tactic Frank had warned me about months earlier. But something shifted in that room, a few skeptical faces where there had only been quiet compliance before. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. Walking to my car afterward, Priya caught up to me. "I've had questions about her for a while," she admitted quietly. "But she controls the agenda, the minutes, even who gets to speak. It's hard to push back alone up there." It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. I asked if she'd be willing to look at records more carefully with me. Off the clock, away from Deborah's control. She hesitated, clearly weighing risk against conscience, then nodded once. "I want to see the real books," she said. "All of them." Too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. 2 nights later, Priya sent me scanned copies of the HOA's reserve fund statements, records normally locked behind board-only access. Nearly $40,000 had been withdrawn over 18 months, labeled only as administrative consulting fees, approved solely by Deborah's signature. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. I forwarded everything to Patricia immediately. She confirmed what I already suspected. HOA reserve funds legally required multiple signatures for withdrawals over a certain threshold, a rule apparently ignored entirely whenever Deborah decided the community needed her consulting services. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. Meanwhile, Deborah seemed to sense the ground shifting beneath her, even without knowing exactly why. She started showing up at my cabin unannounced on weekends, always with a clipboard, always citing some new concern that conveniently required entering my property. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. I stopped letting her pass the porch. She didn't like that. "I have a right to inspect for community safety," she insisted one Saturday, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. I calmly reminded her inspections required written notice. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. She left that day visibly rattled, something I hadn't seen from her before. Rachel watched from the window as Deborah's car sat idling in the driveway for a full minute before finally pulling away, like she was recalculating something in her head. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. That night, I installed motion-activated cameras covering every entry point of the cabin, not just the porch. If she was going to keep letting herself in with her master key, I wanted a record complete enough that no one could dismiss or dispute it. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. 3 days later, footage caught her again, 9:47 a.m., using her key. walking straight to the small office room where I kept old family documents and my father's original property deed. The one thing in that cabin I valued most. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. She spent 6 minutes in that room specifically, moving papers around, photographing something with her phone before carefully placing everything back exactly where she'd found it. Whatever she was looking for, this wasn't random snooping. This was targeted and deliberate. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. I showed the footage to Patricia the following morning. She went very still watching it. "That deed," she said slowly. "Does it mention any easement rights, mineral rights, anything unusual about the property boundary near the lake?" I honestly didn't know. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. I drove to the county records office that same afternoon and requested the full historical file on my property. Buried in a 1987 survey addendum was a note about undeveloped lakefront acreage attached to my father's original purchase. Acreage worth considerably more today. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Suddenly Deborah's obsession made a colder kind of sense. This was never really about paint colors or porch swings. My cabin sat on land she wanted. Land she'd apparently been quietly trying to devalue and pressure me off of for months. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. I called Frank that night and read him the survey addendum details. He went quiet, then said something that chilled me. My old shed sat near a similar undeveloped strip. She fined me relentlessly for 8 months before I finally sold. Another piece clicked into place. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. Rachel and I sat at our kitchen table that evening, spreading every piece of evidence across it. Fines, footage, financial records, county documents. Piece by piece, a picture formed of a woman abusing her position for personal profit, dressed up as civic duty. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. I didn't feel angry anymore. Not exactly. I felt something colder and steadier settle into place. Deborah had built her power on people being too tired, too scared, or too polite to fight back. I decided I would be none of those things. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. For a few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over Willow Ridge. No new finds arrived. Deborah's clipboard visits stopped entirely. I almost let myself believe she'd backed off, though some part of me knew predators like her rarely retreat without a reason. Looking back now, I think that was the moment things truly started to shift beneath the surface. Rachel and I used the calm to actually enjoy the cabin again. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings fishing off the old dock my father built. For the first time in months, it felt like our sanctuary instead of a battleground. It wasn't much on its own, but it was enough to make me pay closer attention. Priya kept feeding me small pieces from the inside, careful never to be seen passing anything directly. She mentioned Deborah had quietly hired an outside accountant to clean up the reserve fund records, a detail that felt less like transparency and more like damage control. I didn't realize then how much that single moment would end up mattering later. I met with Patricia again to map out our legal options. She explained that exposing fraud publicly, without airtight documentation, risked a defamation countersuit from Deborah. We needed everything locked down: dates, signatures, footage, financial trails before making any public move. At the time, it felt smaller than it turned out to be, the way most turning points do. During this lull, I quietly reached out to two of the families who'd sold their cabins after disputes with Deborah, asking if they'd be willing to share their own records. Both agreed, relieved someone finally believed their years-old complaints weren't just paranoia. I've thought about that conversation many times since, replaying it from every angle I could imagine. One of them, a retired teacher named Susan Ortiz, still had her original fine notices boxed away in storage. I always felt something was off, she told me over the phone, but I was one voice against a woman who controlled the whole board. Felt strange, sitting with that thought, knowing how far we'd already come from where we'd started. Walter Briggs, the elderly neighbor fined over gardening fertilizer, offered something unexpected: a handwritten note Deborah had once left on his door, apologizing for confusion after realizing her fine was baseless, then quietly reissuing it anyway 2 weeks later. Even now, I can picture exactly how the light looked that afternoon. Sharp and a little too bright. Each new piece fit into the larger picture like a puzzle slowly resolving into a face I now recognized clearly. Deborah wasn't simply strict or overzealous. She was patient, calculated, and willing to wear down anyone standing between her and property she wanted. Looking back now, I think that was the moment things truly started to shift beneath the surface. Gary, Deborah's husband, approached me unexpectedly one evening at the community mailboxes. He looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. "She wasn't always like this," he said quietly. "The real estate stuff, the control, it got worse after the market crashed on us years ago. It wasn't much on its own, but it was enough to make me pay closer attention." I didn't fully trust him yet, but something in his voice sounded genuinely worn down rather than defensive. "I'm not asking you to forgive her," he added. "I just don't want anyone else losing their home the way we almost lost ours." He walked away before I could respond. I didn't realize then how much that single moment would end up mattering later. That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected. It didn't excuse anything Deborah had done, but it added a strange, human edge to a story that had started feeling almost cartoonishly villainous. People rarely become who they are without a reason behind it. At the time, it felt smaller than it turned out to be, the way most turning points do. Rachel and I spent one quiet Sunday simply organizing everything into a single, clearly labeled case file: fines, footage, financial statements, witness accounts, the survey addendum. Patricia reviewed it and finally nodded. "This is strong," she said. "Strong enough to matter." I've thought about that conversation many times since, replaying it from every angle I could imagine. I felt something like relief settle over me that night, sitting on the dock under a sky full of stars, Rachel's hand in mine. The quiet wouldn't last much longer. I could feel it. At least, it was enough. Felt strange, sitting with that thought, knowing how far we'd already come from where we'd started. The following Monday, I called a locksmith and had every lock on the cabin changed, replacing the old system Deborah's master key still opened. Felt overdue. Less like defiance and more like reclaiming basic ownership of a house that was legally mine. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. I mailed a polite letter to the HOA office, citing the covenant's own privacy clause, explaining that recurring unauthorized entries, documented on camera, had left me no choice but to secure my property properly. I attached no footage yet, keeping that card close. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. Deborah called within an hour of the letter arriving, her voice tight and controlled in a way that told me she was working hard to sound calm. "Master keys exist for everyone's safety," she said. "Changing locks without board approval violates Section 14. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. I told her Section 14 applied to structural modifications, not standard lock replacements, and that Patricia had already confirmed this in writing." Deborah went quiet for a moment, then said she'd have the board review the matter before hanging up abruptly. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. 2 days later, a new fine appeared, $300 for unauthorized security modification, along with a formal request that I surrender a copy of my new key to the HOA office within 72 hours or face escalating penalties. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. I refused in writing, calmly citing my legal right to secure my own private residence. Patricia reviewed my response and added a line reminding the board that demanding personal keys without documented cause could constitute harassment under state homeowner protection statutes. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. Deborah didn't respond to the letter directly. Instead, she brought it up at the next general meeting, reading select portions aloud, framing my refusal as proof I had something to hide from the community she claimed to be protecting. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Priya pushed back publicly for the first time, asking the board to clarify exactly what safety emergency required unrestricted access to a private home. The room went tense. Fire, floods, unforeseen circumstances sounded rehearsed and thin under real questioning. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. A few neighbors murmured agreement with Priya, emboldened by seeing someone finally challenge Deborah openly. It wasn't a revolt, not yet, but it was the first visible crack in the unquestioned authority she'd held over Willow Ridge for nearly a decade. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. Deborah adjourned the meeting early that night, something she'd never done before. Walking to my car, Frank caught up, grinning slightly. "First time I've seen her flustered in years," he said. "Whatever you're doing, Daniel, keep doing it." Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Within the week, an anonymous complaint arrived at Rachel's workplace, alleging she'd misused company resources for personal HOA disputes, a claim so specific and oddly worded that Rachel immediately suspected exactly who might have sent it. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. Rachel's manager dismissed the complaint as baseless within a day, but the attempt itself rattled us both. Deborah wasn't just fighting through the HOA anymore. She was reaching into our personal lives, testing how far she could push before something actually stuck. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. I mentioned this development to Patricia, who added it carefully to our growing file. "Harassment campaigns often escalate right before someone loses real control," she said. If she's reaching outside the HOA now, she's more desperate than confident. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. Deborah's next move came through the board itself. A proposed covenant amendment requiring all homeowners to install HOA-approved smart locks with remote access codes held exclusively by property management, framed publicly as a modern security upgrade for everyone. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. The proposal specifically listed my cabin's address as a high-priority pilot property due to my recent lock change, singling me out in official HOA paperwork for something I'd done entirely within my legal rights as a homeowner. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. Priya voted no immediately, questioning why remote access codes would be held by property management rather than individual owners. Two other board members, emboldened by her, abstained instead of rubber-stamping the proposal the way they usually did. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. The amendment failed to pass by a narrow margin, the first significant vote Deborah had lost in years. She sat perfectly still at the head of the table, jaw tight, before calmly announcing she'd revisit the proposal at a future date. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. That phrase again, future date, the same delay tactic she'd used against me before. Except this time, I understood it differently. It wasn't patience. A predator recalculating after missing its first real strike. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. Walter Briggs approached me quietly after that meeting, pressing a small folded paper into my hand. It was a copy of an old email Deborah had sent his late wife years ago, discussing future development potential of undeveloped lakefront lots exactly like mine. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. The email, dated 6 years earlier, outlined a private real estate venture Deborah had proposed to several original lakefront owners, promising to streamline HOA approval processes for anyone willing to sell their undeveloped acreage to her partnership at a discounted rate. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. Walter's wife had refused, and within a year, Walter found himself facing his first-ever HOA violation. The pattern stretched back further than I'd realized. A slow, patient campaign spanning years, not months, aimed at accumulating undeveloped lakefront land piece by piece. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. I forwarded the email to Patricia immediately. She read it twice before responding. "This shows intent," she said. "Combined with the fine patterns and financial records, this isn't overreach anymore, Daniel. This is a documented scheme." Hearing it named, that plainly hit hard. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. Deborah, unaware how much ground we'd gained, escalated again. A certified letter arrived threatening formal legal action for continued noncompliance, demanding I appear before a special disciplinary hearing within 2 weeks or face a lien filed directly against my property. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Patricia reviewed the letter and laughed. Actually laughed at one particular clause. She's citing a covenant section that was legally struck down in a state ruling 3 years ago, she said. Either she doesn't know, Or she's counting on you not knowing either. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see. But I kept pulling at it anyway. I decided not to correct Deborah's error directly, letting her walk confidently toward a hearing built on a foundation Patricia said would collapse the moment anyone with legal knowledge examined it closely. Sometimes the smartest move was simply staying quiet and prepared. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Rachel worried, understandably, about how far Deborah might go before that hearing arrived. "She's not thinking clearly anymore," Rachel said one night. "People who feel control slipping away don't get calmer. They get reckless." I didn't disagree with her assessment. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Gary appeared at my door unexpectedly one evening, looking more shaken than during our first conversation. "She's been staying up late, going through old land records," he said quietly. "I think she knows people are starting to ask questions she can't easily answer anymore." I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. I asked Gary directly, for the first time, whether he'd testify if things ever reached a formal legal proceeding. He hesitated a long moment before nodding slowly. "I've watched her hurt too many people," he said. "I won't lie for her anymore." Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. That admission felt significant. A genuine crack forming in the last person who might have shielded Deborah from real consequences. I thanked him, careful not to push further, aware that trust built slowly could shatter just as quickly under too much pressure. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. Priya continued quietly gathering board documentation, careful never to draw obvious suspicion. She discovered a second, smaller account tied to the HOA's tax filings. One Deborah apparently controlled independently, separate from the reserve fund Priya had already flagged months earlier. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. The account, labeled simply Community Development Fund, had received several deposits matching the exact amounts of settlement payments made to homeowners who'd sold under pressure. Money that should have returned to the HOA, instead routed somewhere else entirely. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. I felt something settle heavily in my chest reading Priya's summary. This wasn't just fraud against individual homeowners anymore. It was fraud against the entire community. Funds meant for shared maintenance and improvements quietly diverted for years without anyone noticing or asking. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. With the disciplinary hearing approaching, Deborah shifted tactics again, this time appealing directly to community sympathy. She sent a mass email describing herself as under attack by disgruntled homeowners resistant to necessary change, framing herself as the victim of the story. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. A few longtime residents, unaware of everything building quietly behind the scenes, responded supportively, praising Deborah's years of dedicated service to Willow Ridge. Stung a little, watching genuine trust misdirected toward someone who'd spent years quietly exploiting exactly that trust. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. Rachel reminded me, gently, that public opinion wasn't the battle that mattered most right now. Let her have the sympathy email, she said. It won't matter once the truth actually comes out with real evidence behind it. She was right, as usual. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. 2 nights before the hearing, my new cameras caught something unexpected. A locksmith's van parked near my cabin at 11 p.m. A man examining my new lock closely under a flashlight while Deborah stood nearby, watching, arms crossed impatiently. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. The footage showed them talking for several minutes before the locksmith shook his head, apparently declining whatever request Deborah had made, packing his tools back into the van and driving away without ever touching my door. Whatever she'd asked, he'd refused. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. I forwarded that footage to Patricia immediately, hands slightly unsteady, attempting to bypass a lock without owner consent. At night, on private property, Patricia said carefully, "That's not a covenant violation anymore, Daniel. That's attempted unlawful entry. This changes things significantly." Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. Patricia advised filing an official police report documenting the attempted entry, separate entirely from the HOA dispute. I hesitated briefly, worried about escalating things further, before realizing I'd been playing defense for months while Deborah escalated freely without consequence. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. I filed the report the next morning. The responding officer, a measured man named Officer Reyes, reviewed my footage carefully, nodding slowly at certain moments. "This is clear enough," he said. "We'll follow up with the individual identified in the footage." Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Word of the police report spread through Willow Ridge faster than I expected, distorted almost immediately into rumors. Some said I'd been the one caught trespassing. Others claimed a break-in had happened at Deborah's own property instead of mine. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. I learned later exactly who'd spread that distorted version first. Deborah had apparently told several neighbors, preemptively, that I'd been harassing her with false accusations, positioning herself as the victim again before the actual truth could reach anyone directly. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. Officer Reyes contacted Deborah for a statement regarding the locksmith footage. According to Cheryl, who overheard part of the call from the HOA office, Deborah claimed the locksmith visit had been a routine security consultation, unrelated to my property specifically. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. The explanation didn't match the footage timestamp, location, or the locksmith's own visible hesitation and refusal. Officer Reyes noted the inconsistency in his report, though no formal charges followed yet. Not enough, alone, to build a full case. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. Still, something had shifted permanently. For the first time, an outside authority beyond the HOA's own controlled hearings had looked at evidence and found Deborah's explanation didn't hold together. That mattered more than I think even Deborah initially realized. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. 2 days before the scheduled disciplinary hearing, Deborah abruptly postponed it, citing a vague scheduling conflict that Cheryl privately admitted didn't actually exist on any calendar she managed. Deborah was stalling, buying time to figure out her next move. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. I didn't feel relief exactly, watching her retreat like that. I felt the specific, uneasy quiet that comes before something breaks completely, the sense that Deborah Hanley, cornered and losing control for the first time in years, was about to do something far worse. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. Rather than back down, Deborah escalated in a direction none of us fully anticipated. She filed a police report of her own, claiming I had illegally changed locks on a shared community access property, misrepresenting my private cabin as HOA-owned infrastructure entirely. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. The report specifically alleged that Deborah, in her role as HOA president, had attempted a routine safety check and found herself locked out and unable to verify occupant safety. Language clearly crafted to make her intrusion sound like legitimate concern instead of trespassing. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. I received a call from a different officer this time, requesting I come to the station to clarify property ownership details. I brought my deed, tax records, and Patricia along, unwilling to walk into anything without documentation and legal support present. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. The officer reviewed everything methodically, comparing my deed against county records confirming sole private ownership. Within 20 minutes, he acknowledged the report appeared to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding or misrepresentation of my cabin's actual legal status. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Still, the damage rippled through the community before the misunderstanding could be corrected. By that Saturday morning, several neighbors had gathered near my driveway, drawn by rumors that police had been called over some kind of break-in at my cabin. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. I stood on my porch, key in hand, watching Deborah arrive theatrically late, feigning shock at seeing officers already speaking with me calmly instead of arresting me the way her version of events had apparently promised the gathering crowd. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. There's clearly been a serious misunderstanding, Deborah announced loudly to the small crowd, her voice pitched for an audience rather than for me specifically. Officer Reyes, standing nearby, exchanged a brief, knowing glance with his colleague that told me he'd seen this pattern before. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Neighbors murmured, unsure who to believe, watching Deborah's confident performance against my quiet insistence on simply showing my documentation. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. Spoke louder than anything either of us could say. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Frank stepped forward from the small crowd, addressing Deborah directly for the first time in years. Maybe explain why you called police on a man standing at his own front door with his own keys, he said. The crowd went quiet, waiting. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Deborah's composure cracked slightly, just enough for people to notice. I was concerned about community safety, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Priya, standing near the back, quietly recorded the entire exchange on her phone. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. The officers eventually confirmed publicly, briefly, that no crime had occurred and that ownership records clearly matched my documentation. Deborah left quickly afterward, offering no further explanation, her car pulling away faster than usual down the narrow community road. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore, not after everything that had already happened between us. That evening, Rachel and I sat together, both of us shaken more than we wanted to admit. She actually called the police on you, Rachel said quietly. Over your own front door. Something about hearing it stated plainly made the reality land harder. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. I realized then that Deborah wasn't simply protecting territory or property value anymore. She'd crossed into something more desperate and personal, willing to weaponize actual law enforcement against a neighbor rather than accept losing control over land she'd wanted for years. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. That night, I made a decision. If Deborah couldn't be trusted to respect ordinary locks, ordinary boundaries, or ordinary decency, I'd install something she genuinely couldn't beat. A commercial-grade smart lock system with encrypted access, tamper alerts, and continuous recorded logging. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. I researched for hours before choosing a system engineers used for secure facility access, biometric backup, steel-reinforced bolt casing, and a companion app logging every single attempt, successful or not, with time-stamped alerts sent directly to my phone in real time. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. The installer, a quiet professional named Marcus, mentioned he'd installed similar systems for people dealing with difficult situations before: restraining orders, contentious divorces, exactly the kind of determined, entitled intrusion I was now dealing with from someone in my own community. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. Within days of installation, the system logged its first attempt, a failed key insertion at 2 a.m., followed immediately by what the log identified as a bump key technique, a method locksmiths use, applied clumsily by someone clearly untrained in using it. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. The footage showed Deborah herself, illuminated by her phone's flashlight, working at my new lock for nearly 4 minutes before giving up entirely, glancing nervously over her shoulder before hurrying back toward her own cabin 2 lots down the road. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. I watched that footage 3 times, feeling something shift from anger into something colder and more resolved. She hadn't just crossed a line. She'd crossed it in the middle of the night, alone, desperate enough to try breaking into my home herself. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. I sent the footage to Patricia and, separately, to Officer Reyes, careful this time to document everything through proper legal channels rather than confronting Deborah directly. Patricia's response came within the hour. "This is attempted burglary, Daniel. This is no longer a gray area." Patricia made a note of it, The way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Officer Reyes called the next morning, his voice notably more serious than during our previous interactions. "We'll need the original footage files. Unedited. Timestamp verified," he said. "Given the pattern you've documented, this may connect to an ongoing broader investigation." I hadn't known there was one. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. He explained, carefully, that 2 other reports from the surrounding county, unrelated to Willow Ridge directly, had recently flagged similar patterns involving an HOA official pressuring homeowners toward property sales. My case, apparently, wasn't isolated the way I'd assumed. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. That revelation reframed everything. Deborah wasn't simply a local problem confined to one community. She'd potentially been running some version of this scheme across multiple properties, multiple HOAs, wherever her real estate connections and board influence allowed her enough access and authority. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Meanwhile, unaware her nighttime attempt had been fully documented, Deborah pushed forward at the next board meeting with renewed aggression, demanding an emergency vote to force a compliance sale clause against homeowners deemed persistently non-compliant, a clause aimed unmistakably at me. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. Priya challenged the proposal immediately, asking pointed questions about its legal basis. 2 other board members, visibly uncomfortable, finally admitted they'd felt pressured into past votes, worried about becoming Deborah's next target if they ever openly disagreed with her. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. The confession, small as it seemed, cracked something open in that room. For years, silence had protected Deborah more effectively than any actual rule or covenant clause. Watching that silence finally break felt like watching a dam give way after holding far too long. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. Deborah, sensing the room turning against her proposal, grew visibly agitated, her voice rising sharply for the first time in any meeting I'd attended. "You'll regret undermining me," she said, looking directly at Priya, before catching herself and forcing a tight smile. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. The threat, spoken aloud in front of the full board, landed heavily in the silent room. Even her staunchest remaining supporters shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond to a version of Deborah none of them had ever seen exposed so plainly before. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. The compliance sale proposal failed by a wide margin, board members voting against it almost unanimously. Deborah sat rigid at the head of the table afterward, staring at nothing in particular, the room around her quieter than it had been in years. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. Walking out that night, Gary approached me one final time before the hearing everyone knew was now inevitable. "She's not going to stop on her own," he said quietly. "Whatever you have, use all of it. She's past reasoning with at this point." It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. I asked Gary directly whether he'd finally testify formally, on the record, about everything he'd witnessed over the years. This time he didn't hesitate at all. Yes, he said simply. I should have done this a long time ago. Something in his voice sounded almost relieved. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. Susan Ortiz and Walter Briggs both agreed to provide formal written statements as well. Their years-old grievances finally finding a moment where someone was actually listening, organizing, and building toward something more than isolated complaints scattered across separate, forgotten years. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. Patricia helped compile everything into a single formal complaint. Fines, footage, the burglary attempt, financial records, the real estate connections, witness statements, submitting copies simultaneously to the county sheriff's office, the state HOA oversight board, and Willow Ridge's own board members. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. The oversight board's response came faster than expected, scheduling a mandatory emergency hearing within 2 weeks, citing credible allegations of financial misconduct and abuse of authority serious enough to require immediate, formal review beyond anything the local HOA board could handle alone. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Deborah received formal notice of the hearing the same day I did, delivered by certified mail directly to her home. Gary later told me she read it standing in their kitchen, went completely silent, then locked herself in her office for nearly 3 hours. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. Whatever calculations she was making behind that closed door, I knew one thing clearly now. The quiet, careful campaign I'd built for months was about to collide directly with whatever desperate, reckless move Deborah decided to make next, and there was no turning back for either of us. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. In the days before the emergency hearing, Deborah's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Neighbors reported seeing her car parked outside several homes late at night, engine idling, as though she were watching, calculating, deciding who might testify against her when the moment finally arrived. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. Susan Ortiz called me unnerved, describing an anonymous note left on her door. Some things are better left in the past. No signature, no explanation. But Susan recognized the handwriting immediately from years of fine notices stuffed into her mailbox. It wasn't much on its own, but it was enough to make me pay closer attention. I forwarded the note to Patricia and Officer Reyes together. "Witness intimidation," Patricia said flatly. "This strengthens our case considerably, but it also means she's not thinking rationally anymore. Be careful, all of you, over the next 2 weeks." I promised her we would. Looking back now, I think that was the moment things truly started to shift beneath the surface. Rachel insisted on staying at her sister's place temporarily, just until the hearing passed, unwilling to risk anything happening while I worked late in the city during the week. I hated the arrangement, but understood the caution completely given everything unfolding around us. I didn't realize then how much that single moment would end up mattering later. Priya reported that Deborah had stopped attending regular office hours at the HOA building entirely, delegating basic operations to Cheryl while she, according to rumors, met privately with a lawyer of her own, presumably preparing some kind of defense strategy. It wasn't much on its own, but it was enough to make me pay closer attention. Meanwhile, Patricia and I worked late into several evenings organizing our formal submission for the oversight hearing, chronological timelines, cross-referenced financial statements, sworn witness statements, and every piece of footage compiled into a single, undeniable narrative of years of calculated abuse. At the time, it felt smaller than it turned out to be, the way most turning points do. Gary provided one final, crucial piece, bank statements from a personal account he'd discovered, showing deposits matching almost exactly the settlement amounts several pressured homeowners had received, funds that should have gone through official HOA channels instead of Deborah's private accounts. I didn't realize then how much that single moment would end up mattering later. I found these going through old tax documents, Gary admitted quietly, sliding a folder across my kitchen table one evening. I should have looked sooner. I think part of me didn't want to know how bad it actually was. I understood that feeling completely. I've thought about that conversation many times since, replaying it from every angle I could imagine. With Gary's documents added, Patricia estimated the total misappropriated funds at nearly $110,000 over 6 years, money drawn from HOA reserves, settlement diversions, and what appeared to be inflated consulting fees billed directly to the community. At the time, it felt smaller than it turned out to be, the way most turning points do. The number staggered me when I first heard it. This wasn't overzealous rule enforcement anymore. Wasn't even simple property scheming. It was sustained, deliberate financial fraud against an entire community that had trusted Deborah, year after year, with their shared money and safety. Felt strange, sitting with that thought, knowing how far we'd already come from where we'd started. 2 days before the hearing, an unexpected email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. A former homeowner named Linda Chow, who'd sold her cabin 3 years earlier after what she described as relentless, targeted harassment nearly identical to my own experience. I've thought about that conversation many times since, replaying it from every angle I could imagine. Linda had moved out of state, assuming nothing would ever come of reporting what happened to her alone. Seeing local news coverage of the upcoming oversight hearing, shared by a mutual acquaintance, she reached out immediately, offering her own documentation and willingness to testify remotely. Even now, I can picture exactly how the light looked that afternoon. Sharp and a little too bright. Her records added yet another confirmed victim. Another sale pushed through under manufactured pressure. Another piece of evidence showing this wasn't isolated incidents but a sustained, years-long pattern spanning far more of the community than any of us had initially realized. Felt strange, sitting with that thought, knowing how far we'd already come from where we'd started. Patricia filed an updated submission including Linda's statement the morning before the hearing, strengthening an already substantial case into something she described as about as airtight as these situations ever get. I felt something like relief mixed with lingering, nervous tension. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. The night before the hearing, couldn't sleep much, running through every possible outcome in my head. Rachel called from her sister's place, her voice steady and reassuring. "You've done everything right," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you fought this the correct way." Even now, I can picture exactly how the light looked that afternoon. Sharp and a little too bright. I thought about my father then, about the cabin he'd left me, about how something meant purely as a sanctuary had become the center of a fight I never wanted but couldn't walk away from once it started. I hoped, quietly, he'd understand why I stayed and fought. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. Priya texted late that night, confirming she'd be presenting board-level testimony first thing at the hearing, walking the oversight committee through months of documented votes, proposals, and the pattern of intimidation she'd personally witnessed unfold from inside Deborah's own meetings. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. Frank called too, offering something unexpected he still had, buried in old records. The original inflated appraisal Deborah's associated brokerage had used to justify his shed fine years earlier, a document proving the fine amount had been deliberately calculated to force a sale. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Walter Briggs, despite his age and health concerns, insisted on attending the hearing in person rather than submitting only a written statement. "I want her to see my face when I say it," he told me over the phone, his voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and cold, the kind of sharp autumn light that made the whole valley around Willow Ridge look almost peaceful, deceptively calm compared to everything building quietly toward its breaking point inside the county administrative building an hour away. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Rachel drove up early to meet me, refusing to let me walk into that hearing room alone. Patricia met us in the parking lot, her briefcase heavier than usual, packed with copies of every document we'd spent months carefully assembling into an undeniable case. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Inside, the oversight committee room felt smaller and more formal than the casual clubhouse meetings I'd grown used to. 3 officials seated at a raised table, recording equipment already running, a court reporter typing quietly near the corner of the room. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore, not after everything that had already happened between us. Deborah arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by her own attorney, a sharply dressed man who barely glanced at anyone else in the room. She looked composed, rehearsed, the same confident mask she'd worn through every HOA meeting for the past 9 years. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Gary sat separately from her, near the back of the room, close to where I was seated with Rachel and Patricia. Deborah's eyes flicked toward him once, something unreadable crossing her expression, before she turned forward and straightened her posture deliberately. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. The committee chair opened the hearing, outlining the allegations formally: financial misconduct, abuse of authority, harassment, and attempted unlawful entry. Hearing it all stated plainly, officially, in that quiet formal room, made months of chaos suddenly feel concrete and undeniably real. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore, not after everything that had already happened between us. Patricia presented our timeline first, methodical and unhurried, walking the committee through fines without evidence, the reserve fund withdrawals, the real estate connections, and finally the footage of Deborah's attempted entry using a bump key late one night in my driveway. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. The committee members watched that particular clip in complete silence. One of them leaning forward slightly as Deborah's face became clearly visible in her own phone's flashlight glow, working at my lock before finally giving up and hurrying away into the dark. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. Deborah's attorney objected to the footage's admissibility, arguing it had been obtained without proper notice. The committee chair overruled him almost immediately, noting Colorado law permitted homeowners to record their own private property without any special notification requirement whatsoever. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. I glanced at Deborah as that ruling landed. For the first time since I'd known her, something in her composed expression genuinely cracked. Not anger this time, but something closer to fear. The look of someone finally realizing the walls were closing in. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. Priya testified next, describing years of pressured votes, controlled agendas, and the quiet fear that kept most board members from ever questioning Deborah directly. Her voice shook slightly at first, then steadied as she described the specific meeting where the compliance sale clause had been proposed. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. She told me directly I'd regret undermining her, Priya said, reading the moment word for word from her own notes, in front of the entire board. That wasn't hypothetical language. That was a threat, and everyone in that room understood it exactly that way. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Deborah's attorney tried repeatedly to characterize the statement as figurative, boardroom frustration rather than genuine intimidation. The committee chair asked Priya directly whether she'd felt threatened in that moment. Absolutely, Priya answered without hesitation. That's exactly why I started documenting everything afterward. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Frank testified next, presenting the inflated appraisal document tied to his old shed fine, explaining how the number had matched almost exactly the minimum threshold needed to trigger a forced compliance sale under the covenant clause Deborah herself had authored years earlier. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. Walter Briggs spoke slowly but clearly, describing the fertilizer fine, the quiet apology note, and the fine's quiet reissuing 2 weeks later despite Deborah's own written acknowledgement that the original citation had been baseless from the very beginning. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. I paid it anyway, Walter said, his voice catching slightly. I was 76 years old and tired of fighting. I didn't know how many other people she'd done this to until Daniel started asking questions. Deborah stared straight ahead, expression carefully blank. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not after everything that had already happened between us. Susan Ortiz's statement, read aloud by Patricia since Susan couldn't attend in person, described nearly identical pressure tactics leading to her own sale years earlier, fines without evidence, sudden real estate assistance offers, and a quiet sense that resistance simply wasn't worth the exhaustion. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. Linda Chow's testimony followed remotely by video call. Her calm, detailed account matching the pattern precisely from 3 years earlier and hundreds of miles removed from the current proceedings, confirming this wasn't isolated to Willow Ridge's most recent conflicts alone. I didn't say anything out loud, but I noticed, and I kept noticing after that. By the time Gary took the stand, the room had grown noticeably heavier, the weight of 6 confirmed victims settling over everyone present. Deborah's attorney requested a brief recess before her husband's testimony began. The committee chair granted 5 minutes. Nothing more. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. During the recess, I watched Deborah lean toward her attorney, whispering urgently, her composed mask fully gone now, replaced by something closer to panic barely held in check. Gary sat separately still, staring at his hands, visibly steeling himself for what came next. It stayed with me longer than I expected, turning over quietly in the back of my mind for days. When the hearing resumed, Gary spoke plainly, without notes, describing years of watching his wife's control tighten around their own finances and, eventually, around the community she'd been elected to serve rather than exploit for personal gain and quiet, mounting profit. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. I found bank statements, he said, sliding copies across the table toward the committee. Deposits matching settlement amounts from at least 4 homeowners who sold under pressure. I should have said something years ago. I'm saying it now, however late that is. Something about the timing bothered me more than the act itself, though I couldn't say exactly why yet. Deborah finally broke her silence, standing abruptly despite her attorney's hand on her arm. You don't understand what it took to build this community, she said, voice rising sharply. Every decision I made protected property values for everyone here, including all of you. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. The committee chair asked her to sit and address specific allegations rather than general community contributions. Deborah remained standing another long moment, jaw tight, before finally lowering herself back into her chair, hands gripping the table's edge visibly white-knuckled. I filed it away with everything else, unsure yet how much it would matter later on. The fines were justified, she insisted. Every single one. Patricia calmly presented the footage again, this time slowed down, showing timestamps clearly proving Daniel's location during 2 disputed incidents miles away from the alleged violations she'd cited in official HOA paperwork. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. Deborah's attorney attempted to argue technical camera calibration errors, a defense the committee's own technical consultant dismissed within minutes, confirming the timestamps matched independently verified cellular tower location data pulled from Daniel's phone records for the same disputed dates. Rachel noticed it too, though neither of us said much about it out loud that night. With that technical confirmation, something in the room shifted decisively. The committee members exchanged brief glances, the kind of quiet, coordinated acknowledgement that told me, even before any formal ruling, exactly which direction this hearing was ultimately heading toward. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. Deborah's attorney requested another brief recess to confer privately with his client. The committee chair granted it, though noted for the record that the hearing would proceed regardless, given the volume of documented evidence already formally entered into the official record. Patricia made a note of it, the way she made a note of everything that might matter later. During that second recess, I stepped outside briefly with Rachel, both of us needing air after hours of tense testimony. "It's almost over," she said quietly, squeezing my hand. I nodded, though something in me still braced for one final, desperate move from Deborah. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. When the hearing resumed, Deborah's attorney announced she would no longer contest the financial misconduct allegations directly, though he continued arguing. Mitigating circumstances, stress, community pressure, misguided intentions, language that felt hollow after everything already presented on the record. It became one more line in a file that kept growing heavier with every passing week. The committee chair addressed Deborah directly, asking if she wished to make any final statement before deliberation. She sat silent for a long moment, staring at the table, before finally speaking in a voice noticeably smaller than the one she'd used for 9 years of meetings. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said quietly. It was the closest thing to an admission she'd offered all day, though notably still not a direct apology to any of the specific people she'd harmed throughout the years-long pattern. Officer Reyes added it to the report without much comment, though I could tell he was paying attention. The committee excused everyone for deliberation, estimating perhaps an hour. Rachel, Patricia, and I waited in the hallway alongside Priya, Frank, and Walter, an unlikely coalition formed entirely out of shared, quiet exhaustion finally finding its way towards something resembling justice. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. Gary sat apart from the group, near the window, staring out at the parking lot. I walked over eventually, unsure exactly what to say. "Thank you," I offered simply. He nodded once, still not quite meeting my eyes. "She used to be different," he said quietly. It was exactly the kind of detail Patricia had warned me to watch for from the beginning. I didn't respond to that, unsure it needed a response. Some things people say aren't really meant for conversation. Just quiet acknowledgement of a private grief that had nothing directly to do with me, however tangled our situations had become over the past year. It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. The hour stretched longer than expected, nerves fraying slightly among our small group. Frank cracked a joke about Deborah's clipboard finally facing its own inspection. And despite everything, the tired, genuine laugh moved through us. The first real levity in months of tension. I kept a copy for myself too, unwilling to trust any single record to survive on its own. Finally, the committee reconvened, calling everyone back into the hearing room. Deborah sat rigid beside her attorney, staring straight ahead. The chair shuffled papers briefly before beginning to read the committee's findings aloud in a measured, formal, unhurried voice. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. Based on documented evidence, sworn testimony, and financial records presented today, the chair began, "This committee finds sufficient grounds to substantiate allegations of financial misconduct, abuse of authority, and harassment against Deborah Hanley in her capacity as HOA president." It was a small detail, but small details were exactly what had been missing from every explanation Deborah offered. The room stayed absolutely silent as the findings continued. Immediate removal from her position as HOA president. A formal referral to the county district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to fund misappropriation, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board statewide. It felt like one more thread in a pattern I still couldn't fully see, but I kept pulling at it anyway. Deborah's face went pale, then flushed, her composed mask entirely gone now. She opened her mouth as if to object, then closed it again, apparently recognizing, perhaps for the first time in years, that no amount of confident performance could reverse this particular outcome. I told myself it didn't mean anything yet, though some quiet part of me already suspected otherwise. I felt something unclench in my chest, months of tension finally releasing all at once. Rachel gripped my hand tightly beside me. It wasn't quite over yet. Criminal proceedings would take time, but the woman who'd spent years controlling Willow Ridge had finally, undeniably, lost. I wrote it down anyway, the way I'd learned to write everything down by then, just in case. News of the hearing's outcome spread through Willow Ridge within hours, carried mostly by Priya's careful, factual account rather than rumor this time. Neighbors who'd quietly suffered under Deborah's rule for years finally felt safe enough to share their own stories openly. It didn't fix everything, but it felt, finally, like the ground was shifting in our favor. The HOA office held an emergency meeting the following week to appoint interim leadership. Priya, reluctant at first, agreed to serve as temporary president after several neighbors, including Frank and Walter, insisted she was the only person who'd actually earned the community's trust. It was the kind of thing people noticed but didn't quite know what to do with yet. Cheryl, visibly relieved, admitted openly for the first time how uncomfortable she'd felt for years handling paperwork she suspected was manipulated, unable to say anything without risking her job under Deborah's tight, controlling management of even the smallest office details. Word of it moved through Willow Ridge the way word always did there, quietly and then all at once. The county district attorney's office opened a formal investigation within days, subpoenaing Deborah's financial records, both personal and business, along with documentation from her old real estate brokerage connections spanning multiple HOAs across the county. Not just Willow Ridge alone. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves started exchanging glances I hadn't seen before that week. Investigators contacted Linda Chow and several homeowners from other communities Deborah had apparently influenced over the years, uncovering a pattern far larger than any of us had initially realized existed, stretching back nearly a decade across at least 3 separate developments. It was the kind of thing people noticed but didn't quite know what to do with yet. Gary moved out of the house he'd shared with Deborah 2 weeks after the hearing, staying temporarily with his brother while divorce proceedings began quietly. He sent me a brief message afterward. "Thank you for giving me the courage to finally do this." For the first time in months, it felt like the whole community was quietly holding its breath together. Deborah, stripped of her HOA position and facing mounting legal pressure, largely disappeared from community life entirely. Her once constant presence at every meeting and every neighbor's driveway replaced by an eerie, unfamiliar absence nobody in Willow Ridge quite knew how to process yet. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves started exchanging glances I hadn't seen before that week. One night, nearly a month after the hearing, my new Locks app pinged again. A failed entry attempt. Timestamp 1:14 a.m. The same tired bump key technique. Clumsier this time. More desperate. Footage clearly showing Deborah alone in my driveway once more. For once, that felt like something close to good news, however small it seemed at the time. I watched, almost disbelieving, as she worked at the lock for nearly 10 minutes this time, her movements increasingly frantic, before finally slamming her palm against my door in obvious frustration and walking away, glancing nervously toward neighboring cabins the entire time. For the first time in months, it felt like the whole community was quietly holding its breath together. I forwarded the footage immediately to Officer Reyes, who confirmed it violated explicit terms of a restraining order Rachel and I had quietly filed following the hearing, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate, final attempt from someone who genuinely refused to accept losing. It was a small mercy, but after everything else, I'd learned not to take small mercies for granted. Deborah was arrested 2 days later, charged formally with attempted burglary, violation of a protective order, and, pending the district attorney's continued investigation, multiple counts related to financial fraud and misappropriation of HOA community funds spanning several years and jurisdictions. For once, that felt like something close to good news, however small it seemed at the time. The arrest made local news. A brief segment describing an HOA president accused of years-long fraud and harassment scheme targeting homeowners across multiple communities. Watching it air felt strange, surreal. The private nightmare we'd lived through suddenly reduced to 90 seconds of broadcast footage. Rachel squeezed my hand when I told her, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Frank called that evening, half laughing, half amazed. "Never thought I'd see her name on the actual news," he said. "Karma's got better timing than I expected." Honestly, I found myself laughing too, something I hadn't done freely in longer than I realized. It was a small mercy, but after everything else, I'd learned not to take small mercies for granted. Priya, settling into her new role as interim president, immediately proposed real transparency reforms, public access to all financial records, multiple signature requirements for any withdrawal, and strict written notice rules for any HOA-related property access, closing every loophole Deborah had once exploited. It didn't fix everything, but it felt, finally, like the ground was shifting in our favor. The community voted unanimously to adopt every proposed reform within a single meeting, something that would have taken months of contentious debate under Deborah's old leadership style, now passing almost effortlessly under Priya's straightforward, trust-first approach to running things fairly. Rachel squeezed my hand when I told her, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Rachel and I finally returned to the cabin together permanently that weekend, no longer needing separate arrangements or constant vigilance against unexpected intrusions. The porch swing, replaced weeks earlier, creaked gently in the evening breeze exactly the way it had before everything started. Word of it moved through Willow Ridge the way word always did there, quietly and then all at once. Sitting there together, I thought about how close we'd come to losing this place entirely, not through any fault of our own but through someone else's quiet, patient greed disguised for years as civic responsibility and community protection nobody thought to question closely enough. It didn't fix everything, but it felt, finally, like the ground was shifting in our favor. Walter stopped by that evening, bringing a small jar of fertilizer from his late wife's old gardening supplies, the very item that had started his own quiet grievance years earlier. "Figured you'd appreciate the irony," he said, smiling for what felt like the first time in months. It was the kind of thing people noticed but didn't quite know what to do with yet. Susan Ortiz called from out of state, thanking me for finally giving her years-old complaint somewhere real to land. I stopped believing anyone would ever listen, she admitted. You proved that waiting long enough for the right moment actually matters sometimes. Her words stayed with me. Word of it moved through Willow Ridge the way word always did there. Quietly and then all at once, Linda Chow sent a similar message, along with a photo of the small house she'd bought after leaving Willow Ridge. Clearly happy despite everything. Glad someone finally stopped her, she wrote simply. Wish I'd had the resources to fight back the way you did. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves started exchanging glances I hadn't seen before that week. As the district attorney's investigation continued expanding into neighboring counties, uncovering more victims and more evidence, I realized this had never really been just about my cabin, my locks, or even my father's legacy. It had become something larger than any of us anticipated. It was the kind of thing people noticed but didn't quite know what to do with yet. 6 months later, Deborah accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial on the full range of charges, pleading guilty to fraud, attempted burglary, and violation of a protective order, receiving a sentence including restitution payments and several years of probation with strict conditions. For once, that felt like something close to good news. However small it seemed at the time, the restitution, though unlikely to ever fully recover, would return significant funds to the homeowners she'd defrauded, including a portion earmarked directly for Willow Ridge's community reserve. Money Priya immediately allocated toward long overdue maintenance projects the neighborhood had needed for years. It was a small mercy, but after everything else, I'd learned not to take small mercies for granted. Gary finalized his divorce quietly around the same time, eventually selling the family home and moving closer to his brother's town. He sent one final message before mostly disappearing from Willow Ridge entirely. I hope you and Rachel finally get the peace you deserve here. Rachel squeezed my hand when I told her, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. The community itself changed noticeably in the months following everything. Meetings shorter, friendlier, genuinely collaborative in a way Willow Ridge hadn't experienced in nearly a decade. Neighbors who'd avoided each other out of quiet fear started actually talking, helping, trusting one another again. It didn't fix everything, but it felt, finally, like the ground was shifting in our favor. I kept the smart lock installed long after the immediate threat had passed. Not out of lingering fear anymore, but as a quiet, permanent reminder of exactly how far someone's need for control could reach, and exactly how far ordinary people could push back against it together. For once, that felt like something close to good news, however small it seemed at the time. Some evenings, sitting on that porch with Rachel, I still think about how it all started. A woman with a clipboard, a master key, and an appetite for control she mistook for authority. Never once expecting quiet documentation to eventually become her undoing. It was a small mercy, but after everything else, I'd learned not to take small mercies for granted. My father built this cabin as a place of peace, never imagining it would become the battleground where an entire community finally found the courage to stand together against someone who'd spent years making silence feel like the only safe option available to anyone. Rachel squeezed my hand when I told her, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. The lock on my door still works perfectly, exactly as promised, unbeaten and unbreakable. But the real victory was never really about steel or circuitry. It was about people finally refusing to stay quiet any longer. It didn't fix everything, but it felt, finally, like the ground was shifting in our favor.